Hello, everyone. I'm excited to share a true scary bedtime story with you today. This story might help you drift off to sleep. But before we begin, make sure to snuggle up in your blankets and close your eyes. I know some of you are listening to this story to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. As you relax, I wonder where you're listening from. Maybe a cozy bedroom or perhaps a comfy living room. Either way, get ready for an adventure that might just tickle your imagination. Before we begin, take a deep breath and settle into the comfort of your bed. Feel the soft support of the earth beneath you, steady and strong, just as these stories have stood the test of time. As I count down from 10 to 1, let go of any lingering tension in your body and allow the peaceful energy of this moment to wash over you. 10. Let your shoulders soften. 9. Feel the comfort of your bed beneath you, as if cradling you in warmth. 8. Know that you are safe, and tonight's story will carry you gently into sleep. 7. Close your eyes and feel the rhythm of your breath, steady and calm. 6. Imagine the sounds of nature all around. A soft breeze, the rustling of leaves. 5. Feel your body relax more deeply, surrendering to the peaceful night. 4. You are drifting now, letting go of any remaining thoughts. 3. Each breath takes you deeper into relaxation. 2. You are fully at peace, ready to dream. 1. Now, let the story carry you away into a world where anything is possible. So, as you relax, know that you are part of a tradition that spans generations, where stories like this one have lulled countless others to sleep. Let this be your moment of peace, your escape from the rush of the world. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the adventure unfold as you drift further into restful sleep. And now, we begin. After a long day at school, the young girl sat quietly in her room, staring at the laptop screen. The room was dimly lit, and the soft hum of the computer filled the space. It had been weeks since her grandmother had passed away, but the pain still sat heavy in her heart. Her grandmother had always been there for her, baking sweet bread, telling stories of the old days, and calling her my sunshine. Now, the house felt empty, and the world seemed a little colder without her. One evening, as the girl was scrolling through her emails, she noticed something strange. An email popped up in her inbox, one that shouldn't have been there. It was from her grandmother's account. Her heart skipped a beat, and her hands trembled slightly. How could this be? Her grandmother was gone. She clicked on the message, and her eyes widened at what she saw. The email wasn't long. It only had a few words, but they were enough to send a shiver down her spine. Don't go to the park tomorrow. The girl froze. She rubbed her eyes, thinking maybe she was imagining it. Maybe it was just an old email that somehow got stuck in the system. But no! This email had today's date. She stared at the screen, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced with thoughts, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe it was a glitch, or someone had hacked into her grandmother's account. But who would do such a thing? That night, as she lay in bed, the email played over and over in her mind. Don't go to the park tomorrow. She loved going to the park with her friends. It was where they would laugh, run around, and enjoy the sunshine. But now, the park felt like a place of danger. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head, warning her from beyond. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with restless dreams of shadows creeping through the trees. The next day, the sun was shining brightly, and the world seemed normal. Her friends called, asking her to come to the park, but she hesitated. That email, it had felt so real, so urgent. Her grandmother had never steered her wrong before. Reluctantly, she made an excuse and stayed home, though she wasn't sure if she believed the warning or if she was just being silly. Hours later, the phone rang. She answered it, and on the other end, Her friend's voice was shaky and frightened. "There was an accident at the park," her friend said. "A tree fell right where we were sitting. If you had been there..." The girl's heart raced and her stomach churned. The email had been right. If she had gone to the park, she could have been hurt or worse. But how? How could her grandmother, who had passed away, know about something like this? For the next few days, the girl couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was watching her, that something or someone was trying to protect her from afar. Then, another email came. This one was even stranger. "Don't open the window tonight." The room grew cold as she read the words, and goosebumps spread across her skin. She glanced at the window in her bedroom, which overlooked the quiet street. At night, she often liked to open it to let the cool breeze in. But now, the idea of doing that filled her with dread. What would happen if she did? She didn't want to find out. That night, she made sure to lock the window tight. She pulled the curtains close and sat in her bed, her heart thumping in her chest. Hours passed, and the night grew darker. The wind howled outside, and every little sound seemed louder, more threatening. Then, she heard it, a soft scratching at the window. Her breath caught in her throat. Something, or someone, was outside. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Her heart pounded in her ears, and she pulled the blanket over her head, wishing it would all go away. She didn't dare look, didn't dare peek out from the safety of her bed. The scratching went on for what felt like forever, and then silence. The next morning, she cautiously approached the window. Her hands trembled as she pulled the curtain back, just a little, enough to peek outside. There, on the window pane, were deep scratch marks, as if something with claws had tried to get in. Her stomach twisted in fear. She didn't know what it was, but she knew one thing for sure. It had been trying to get to her. The emails kept coming, each one more cryptic and frightening than the last. "Don't answer the phone tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Stay away from the old house. Something is coming. Be ready." Each time she followed the warnings, something strange would happen. A bad storm hit at 3 o'clock, knocking down power lines. The old house down the street caught fire mysteriously, and each time, she felt her grandmother's presence, as if she were watching over her from someplace beyond, trying to keep her safe. But the fear grew with each new message. The girl began to wonder who, or what, was really sending these emails. Was it truly her grandmother? Or was something else using her grandmother's account to communicate with her? The thought chilled her to the bone. And then, the messages began to change. "Help me. Please, I'm lost. I don't know where I am." The emails were no longer warnings. They were cries for help, desperate and pleading. The girl didn't know what to do. How could she help someone who wasn't even alive anymore? She felt trapped, caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And the more she tried to ignore the emails, the more frequent they became. One night, a final message appeared in her inbox. "Come find me." The girl's hands shook as she read the words. It felt like a command, like something was pulling her towards a place she didn't want to go. She didn't know what it meant, but she had a sinking feeling that if she didn't listen, something terrible would happen. The room grew colder, the shadows longer, and outside, the wind began to howl. She closed her eyes, hoping it was all a bad dream. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning of something far darker. And the next morning, she received another email. The next morning, she received another email. Her eyes darted across the screen, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. This time, the message was shorter than ever before, just one word. Tonight, her stomach dropped, and a deep chill settled in her bones. She stared at the word, unable to tear her eyes away from it. What did it mean? What was going to happen tonight? 1,000 thoughts swirled in her mind, none of them offering comfort. She knew something was coming, something bad. The day felt like it passed in a blur. Every little sound startled her. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her with dark intent. The house felt emptier than ever before, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That something, no, Someone was watching her. She avoided her laptop, afraid of what she might see if she checked her emails again. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky with deep shades of purple and orange, she knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. With trembling hands, she opened her inbox once more. There it was, another email. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than ever before. She clicked on it, and her breath caught in her throat as she read the words. Come to the woods. The woods. The thick, dark forest at the edge of town where no one ever went at night. Even during the day, the trees seemed to loom over you, their branches like twisted fingers reaching for the sky. But at night, the woods became a place of nightmares. No one dared go in after dark. Not after the stories of strange lights, eerie sounds, and things moving in the shadows. But now, the email was telling her to go there, alone, at night. Her heart raced, panic clawing at her insides. She couldn't go. She wouldn't. But deep down, something told her she didn't have a choice. If she didn't go, what would happen? The emails had been right before. Every warning, every message had been a glimpse into something real, something dangerous. If she ignored this one, she shuddered to think of what might come next. The house creaked as the wind picked up outside, howling against the windows like a beast trying to get in. The sky had grown dark, the last bit of light fading away into the blackness of the night. She knew it was time. With shaking legs, she grabbed her jacket and slowly made her way to the front door. The air outside was cold, biting at her skin as she stepped into the darkness. The street lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, every step echoing in her ears as she walked towards the edge of town, towards the woods. The path grew darker the closer she got, the trees towering above her like silent sentinels. Their branches swayed in the wind, making it sound as if they were whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. Her breath came in short gasps, her fear growing with every step. She glanced down at her phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. There was another email. You're close. Her fingers fumbled as she tucked the phone back into her pocket. Close to what? Close to where? She didn't know, but she could feel it. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if something unseen was pressing down on her. The wind rustled the leaves around her, but it wasn't just the wind. There was something else. A soft sound, barely audible, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. Footsteps. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, soft, almost hesitant, like someone or something was following her. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness behind her, but there was nothing, just the trees and the shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she quickened her pace, her feet crunching against the gravel path. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but when she turned again, there was still no one there. The darkness seemed to be playing tricks on her, distorting the shapes of the trees, making the shadows dance in ways they shouldn't. Her legs felt weak, her breath ragged as she broke into a run, the woods closing in around her. The trees whispered her name, or at least, it sounded like her name. The wind carried the soft, eerie sound through the branches, making it seem as if the forest itself was calling out to her, beckoning her deeper into its heart. She wanted to turn back, to run home and lock the door, but she couldn't. Something was pulling her forward, deeper and deeper into the dark. And then, up ahead, she saw it. A light. It was faint, flickering like a candle in the distance, but it was there. Her feet carried her toward it, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. As she got closer, the light grew brighter, revealing an old, crumbling house hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, the windows dark and shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. She had never seen this house before, but somehow it felt familiar. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She hesitated before pulling it out. Another email. Go inside. Her hands trembled as she read the words. Go inside? Into that house? Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. to run as fast as she could. But something else, something stronger, urged her forward. She took a deep breath, her heart hammering in her chest as she stepped toward the door. The old wood groaned under her weight as she pushed it open, the hinges squealing in protest. The air inside was cold, damp, and smelled of decay. Her footsteps echoed through the empty rooms as she stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She took another step, then stopped. There, in the center of the room, was a chair. And sitting in that chair was her grandmother. The girl's heart stopped. It couldn't be. Her grandmother was gone, had been for weeks. But there she was, sitting in the chair, her pale face turned toward the window, her eyes wide and staring at something only she could see. The girl's breath hitched in her throat as she stepped closer, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. "Grandma?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence. Her grandmother didn't move, didn't even blink. She just sat there, as still as a statue, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The girl reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched her grandmother's shoulder. The coldness of her skin sent a shock through her, and she quickly pulled her hand back. Suddenly, her grandmother's head snapped around, her eyes locking onto the girl's with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Her mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't her grandmother's. It was low, raspy, and filled with something dark and malevolent. "Leave." The girl stumbled back, her heart racing in her chest. This wasn't her grandmother. It couldn't be. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a loud bang. The room grew colder, the air thick with something unseen but heavy. The girl's breath came in short, frantic gasps as she backed away from the chair, her eyes wide with fear. The figure in the chair began to rise, slowly, unnaturally, as if its bones didn't quite fit together anymore. The girl's heart pounded in her chest as the figure turned toward her, its eyes dark and hollow, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "Don't you know?" the voice rasped, echoing through the room. "She's been waiting for you." The girl's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, her hands covering her ears as the voice grew louder, more insistent. The figure loomed over her, its twisted face inches from hers. She could feel its cold breath on her skin, could hear the whispers of something dark and ancient in the air around her. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the room fell silent. The girl slowly lowered her hands, her body trembling with fear. The figure was gone, the chair was empty, and the house was quiet once more. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, but the feeling of being watched never left her. She knew, deep down, that whatever had been in that house wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting, watching. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see what the next message would say. But her hand moved on its own, pulling the phone out and unlocking the screen. There was another email. "She's coming." The words sent a chill down her spine. She didn't know who she was, but she knew one thing. She had to get out of the house. Now. She scrambled to her feet, her legs weak and shaky as she ran for the door. But before she could reach it, the floor beneath her gave way, and she fell into the darkness below. She fell into the darkness below. Her screams seemed to disappear into the void as her body tumbled through the cold air. It felt like the world had opened up beneath her, swallowing her whole. Her arms flailed, trying to grab onto something, anything, but there was nothing but blackness all around. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was falling or floating. The sensation of weightlessness consumed her, and her mind raced with fear. Then, with a sudden jolt, she hit the ground. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, and she lay there, stunned, her body aching from the fall. The floor was damp and cold, sending a chill through her bones as she tried to move. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her hands sinking into the soft earth beneath her. Where was she? She blinked, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The air was thick with the smell of wet dirt and decay, and somewhere in the distance, She could hear the soft drip of water echoing in the darkness. She wasn't in the house anymore. No, this place was different. It felt ancient, forgotten, like a place that shouldn't exist. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood up on shaky legs, her breath coming in short gasps. The walls around her were made of rough stone, covered in moss and slick with moisture. It was like a cave deep underground, hidden away from the world above. But there was something more, something wrong about this place. The air felt heavy, as if it was pressing down on her, suffocating her with an unseen force. She had to get out. She had to find a way back. Her fingers fumbled for her phone, hoping it could somehow help her. But when she looked at the screen, the battery was almost dead. The dim light from the screen cast eerie shadows on the walls, making them seem to twist and move as if they were alive. There was no signal, of course, and her phone wouldn't be of much use down here. Still, she held on to it, the faint glow offering a small comfort in the oppressive darkness. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm, though every instinct screamed at her to panic. Her feet moved slowly, cautiously, as she stepped forward, her hand trailing along the rough stone wall to guide her. The ground beneath her was uneven, her shoes slipping on the damp surface as she walked. Every sound seemed magnified in the silence. The soft squish of her footsteps, the distant drip of water, the faint rustle of something she couldn't see. The further she went, the darker it became. The walls closed in around her, the narrow passageway twisting and turning in ways that made her head spin. It felt like she was walking in circles, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of her vision, grew stronger with every step. She could almost feel it, eyes on her, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then she heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, reverberated through the passageway. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, closer, with each passing second. Her heart raced, and her breath hitched in her throat. She froze, her body tense with fear, listening as the growl echoed through the cave. Something was down here with her. She turned, her eyes darting through the darkness, but there was nothing, just shadows, just the endless blackness. But the growl came again, this time from behind her, closer. Panic surged through her veins, and without thinking, she ran. Her feet pounded against the slick ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she raced through the twisting passageways. The growl followed her, growing louder, more menacing. It was right behind her, so close she could feel the vibrations of its footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Her legs burned, her muscles screaming in protest, but she didn't dare slow down. The walls around her seemed to close in tighter, the passageways growing narrower, suffocating her with their closeness. She stumbled, her foot catching on a loose stone, and she fell hard to the ground. Pain shot through her hands and knees as they scraped against the rough earth, but she pushed herself up, gasping for air, her eyes wide with terror. The growl was right there. She turned her head, and her heart nearly stopped. In the darkness, something moved, a shape massive and shadowy, loomed just beyond her vision. It was impossible to make out its features, but she could feel its presence, cold, malicious, hungry. The growl rumbled from deep within its chest, low and menacing, vibrating through the air like a warning. It was waiting, watching, as if it was toying with her, letting her know that it could catch her whenever it wanted. For a split second, time seemed to slow. Her mind raced, her thoughts colliding in a chaotic whirl of fear and confusion. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know where to go. All she knew was that she couldn't stay here. She had to move, had to escape, or it would get her. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she pushed herself to her feet and took off again, her legs trembling beneath her as she ran. The passageway twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the darkness, but there was no time to think, no time to worry about where she was going. All that mattered was getting away. The growl followed her, echoing through the tunnel like a dark promise. She could feel it now, its breath on the back of her neck, cold and foul, like rotting meat. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest she thought it might burst. The walls of the cave seemed to shift around her, the passageways growing narrower and more treacherous. Her hands grazed the rough stone as she stumbled forward, desperate to escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the growl stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness, her breath ragged and uneven as she slowed to a stop. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, scanning the darkness behind her. The passageway was empty, the shadows were still, but she could feel it. Whatever had been chasing her was still there, lurking just out of sight. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her hands trembling as she unlocked the screen. Another email. She's here. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to be told who she was. She could feel it. The presence that had been watching her, guiding her, had finally arrived. And now, it was here with her, in this dark, forgotten place. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, as if the very darkness itself was closing in around her. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, her mind racing with fear. She didn't know where to go, didn't know how to escape. All she knew was that something was coming for her. And then, from the shadows, she saw it. A figure, pale and ghostly, stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and unfeeling. The figure moved closer, its footsteps echoing in the silence, and with each step, the air grew heavier, suffocating her with its presence. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the crushing silence. "Please don't." The figure didn't stop. It kept coming, its pale form gliding through the darkness like a wraith, silent and deadly. Her back hit the cold stone wall, and she realized with a sickening sense of dread that there was nowhere left to run. She was trapped. The figure loomed closer, its presence overwhelming, filling the small space with a suffocating sense of dread. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the darkness like a blade. The girl's heart raced, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She pressed herself against the wall, her mind screaming at her to move, to run, to do something, but her body wouldn't respond. She was frozen, trapped in the gaze of something far more powerful than she could comprehend. The figure reached out, its hand pale and skeletal, and the air around them seemed to freeze. The girl could feel the cold seeping into her skin, into her bones, as the hand drew closer. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the touch, for the end. But then, just as the cold fingers were about to brush against her skin, something changed. A sound, faint at first but growing louder, echoed through the cave. It was distant, like the ringing of a bell or the chiming of a clock, but it was enough to break the spell. The figure stopped, its hand hovering in the air for a moment before slowly pulling back. The girl's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure stepped away, retreating into the shadows. The cold air lifted, the oppressive weight of the darkness easing just slightly. She gasped for breath, her body trembling with fear and relief. But she knew it wasn't over. The air still crackled with tension, like a storm waiting to break. The figure may have retreated into the shadows, but its presence lingered, thick and heavy in the cave. Her hands trembled as she wiped the cold sweat from her forehead. Her breath was shallow, each inhale rattling in her chest. She pressed herself harder against the stone wall, her mind racing with the thought that the figure could reappear at any moment, even closer this time, even more dangerous. The bell-like sound that had saved her was gone now, leaving behind only silence, a deep, unsettling silence that pressed against her ears, making her feel even more alone in this forgotten place. The walls, the ceiling, the ground. All seemed to close in around her, tighter and tighter, as if the cave itself was alive, breathing, waiting. And then, another sound broke the silence. It was a soft, almost imperceptible rustle, like fabric brushing against the stone floor. Her eyes darted toward the source, but all she could see was darkness. The blackness seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing every flicker of light from her phone. She lifted her phone higher, the faint glow barely piercing the thick shadows. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but her body wouldn't obey. Her legs felt like lead, frozen in place by the overwhelming fear that clung to her like a second skin. The rustling grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to her. She clenched her teeth, every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for something to reach out from the darkness and drag her away. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst, her pulse racing in her ears. She could feel the cold breath of whatever was watching her, the same breath she'd felt earlier, chilling her to her core. And then in the dim light of her phone, she saw it. A hand. It was pale, impossibly thin, with long, spindly fingers that seemed to stretch out toward her. The nails were blackened, jagged like claws, and the skin was mottled in gray, as if it had been drained of all life. The hand moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for her with an eerie grace that sent shivers down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but all she could do was watch in horror as the hand crept closer, inch by inch. Her mind raced with the thought of what might happen if it touched her, if it dragged her down into the darkness, into whatever nightmare lay beyond the shadows. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "Stop!" It was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to freeze the hand in its tracks. The fingers hovered just inches from her skin, trembling, as if torn between obeying the voice and seizing her anyway. The girl's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in the stillness as she stared at the hand, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. Instead, it slowly withdrew, retreating into the shadows as if pulled away by an invisible force. The girl's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she watched the hand disappear into the blackness, leaving her alone once more. But she wasn't really alone, was she? No. Something else was still here. She could feel it, its gaze cold and unfeeling, watching her from the darkness. She turned, her eyes scanning the cave for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the endless blackness, stretching on forever, hiding whatever horrors lurk within. And then, the voice came again. "You shouldn't have come." It was the same voice from before, soft and distant. But this time there was something different about it. A sadness, an almost mournful tone that sent chills down her spine. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as she searched the shadows for the source of the voice. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no answer, just a soft drip of water somewhere in the distance, the faint rustle of air through the cave. The girl's fingers tightened around her phone, her only source of light in this suffocating darkness. The battery was nearly dead now, the screen dimming with each passing moment. Soon, she would be completely blind, left to navigate the labyrinthine tunnels with nothing but her fear to guide her. The thought sent a wave of panic crashing over her. She had to get out. She had to find a way back to the surface before it was too late. But how? The cave seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense, leading her deeper into the earth with each step. It was as if the cave itself was alive, shifting and changing to trap her inside. And then, the voice spoke again. "Follow me." It wasn't a command, but rather a gentle suggestion, as if the voice knew she had no other choice. The girl hesitated, her mind racing with the fear that this voice, this presence, might be leading her into a trap. But what choice did she have? She couldn't stay here, waiting for whatever had reached out of the shadows to return. With a deep breath, she took a step forward, her body trembling with every movement. The voice was silent now, but she could feel its presence, guiding her through the dark. The air grew colder with each step, the walls closing in tighter until it felt like she could barely breathe. Her heart raced, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to run in the opposite direction, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. The passageway narrowed, the ceiling dipping lower until she was forced to crouch. Her hands brushed against the rough stone walls, cold and damp as she moved through the tight space. The darkness was oppressive, pressing in on her from all sides, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. And then she saw it, a faint light, just ahead, barely visible in the suffocating blackness. Her heart leaped with hope, but as she moved closer, she realized that the light wasn't coming from the surface. No! It was something else, something far more sinister. The light flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls of the cave. It wasn't a natural light. It was cold, harsh, like the glow of a fluorescent bulb, but with an eerie, otherworldly quality. The girl hesitated, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the light. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to keep moving forward. As she stepped into the light, the cave opened up into a large chamber. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light. The air was thick with a sense of dread, the kind of feeling that made her skin crawl, like 1,000 unseen eyes were watching her every move. And in the center of the chamber, something moved. It was a figure, hunched and twisted, its back to her as it crouched over something on the ground. The girl's breath hitched in her throat as she took a step closer, her heart racing with fear. She couldn't see what the figure was doing, but the sound it made, a soft, wet squelching, sent chills down her spine. She took another step, her hands trembling as she raised her phone, its dim light casting long shadows on the walls. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence, but the air around it seemed to grow colder, thicker with each passing second. And then, without warning, the figure turned. The girl's blood ran cold. The face that stared back at her wasn't human. It was twisted, deformed, like something out of a nightmare. Its eyes were wide, empty black pits that seemed to suck in the light, and its mouth was a gaping maw of jagged, broken teeth. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over its bones, and its hands, those long, spindly fingers, were covered in blood. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure stood, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. The girl stumbled backward, her heart racing as she tried to put as much distance between herself and the creature as possible. But there was nowhere to go. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in around her, the passageway she had come through now gone, swallowed by the shifting stone. She was trapped, and the creature knew it. It moved closer, its body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways as it stepped into the flickering light. The girl's legs trembled beneath her, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she backed away, her eyes wide with terror. But it was no use. The creature reached out, its long fingers brushing against her arm, cold and clammy like the touch of death itself. The girl's heart raced, her mind screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something, but her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen, trapped in the creature's gaze, its black eyes boring into her soul. And then the voice came again. "She's here." The girl's breath hitched in her throat as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just some random nightmare. This wasn't just some strange coincidence. No, this was something far more terrifying. The girl's breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tightening as the creature's cold fingers lingered on her arm. The sensation sent a shock through her, like ice crawling under her skin, rooting her in place. Every instinct screamed for her to flee, to wrench herself free from the thing that stood before her. But her muscles betrayed her. She was trapped in its gaze, and the voice, so soft, yet so overpowering, seemed to echo all around her, as if it were coming from the very walls of the cave itself. "She's here." The voice reverberated through the space, bouncing off the stone walls, amplifying in its eerie calm. The girl's eyes darted from the creature's twisted face to the shadows that clung to the edges of the chamber. The darkness seemed to pulse and shift, alive with something unseen. She swallowed hard, a tremor running through her body as the coldness deepened, wrapping itself around her like a shroud. The creature didn't move, its pale, deformed face locked in an expression of almost childlike curiosity. It tilted its head, eyes black as voids, as if it were studying her, trying to understand her fear. The girl's breath came faster now, the sound of her pulse thundering in her ears. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but her throat felt like it had been sealed shut. There was no sound in this world but the echo of that voice, soft, chilling, and omnipresent. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating, as if the very air in the cave had turned thick and oppressive. The symbols carved into the walls seemed to writhe, the flickering light casting grotesque shapes that danced and twisted, like spirits trying to break free from their prison. In the corner of her eye, the darkness shifted again. This time, she was sure she saw movement, something beyond the reach of the light, something watching, waiting. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone tighter, the dim glow barely enough to pierce the inky blackness that surrounded her. The creature remained still, its gaze never leaving hers, its mouth slowly curling into a grotesque, unnatural smile. And then, the voice came again, this time softer, almost a whisper. "She's waiting." Her skin prickled as she felt a presence, something far more menacing than the creature before her, stirring in the depths of the cave. It was as if the very earth beneath her feet was alive, vibrating with an energy she couldn't understand. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, coiling around her like smoke, and she could feel it. Something ancient, something powerful, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The girl's heart hammered in her chest as she slowly stepped back, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to run, but every step felt like a battle, the weight of the air pressing down on her, slowing her movements. The creature didn't follow her. It remained where it was, watching with that same unsettling smile, as if it knew there was nowhere for her to go. The light from her phone flickered, and her stomach dropped as she glanced down at the screen. The battery was almost dead. She was running out of time. Desperation clawed at her insides as she frantically looked around the chamber, searching for any sign of an exit, any way to escape the nightmare that had swallowed her whole. But there was nothing. Only darkness. And then, without warning, the light from her phone blinked out. For a moment, everything was silent. She stood there in the pitch blackness, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence was suffocating, thick with dread. She could no longer see the creature, no longer see the walls, the floor, nothing but an endless void of black. Her pulse quickened as her mind raced, imagining what could be creeping toward her in the dark, unseen and unheard. Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence. It was a soft, dragging noise, like something being pulled across the stone floor. Her breath hitched, her eyes wide though she could see nothing. The sound came closer, slow and deliberate, the scraping of something heavy, something large, echoing in the darkness. She stumbled backward, her body trembling with terror, her hands outstretched to feel for the walls, for anything to guide her, but all she felt was cold, empty space. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right behind her. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, but she was frozen in place, her body locked in a grip of fear so tight she could barely breathe. And then a voice, different from the first, deeper, more guttural, whispered in her ear. "You shouldn't have come," she gasped, her body jolting as if she'd been struck by lightning. The voice was so close. She could feel the breath on her neck, hot and foul, like the stench of rotting flesh. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, stifling the scream that threatened to tear from her throat. She spun around, but there was nothing, only the suffocating darkness and the echo of that terrible voice.
The dragging noise stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, And then, from somewhere deep within the cave, she heard it. A low, guttural growl. It rumbled through the air, vibrating the stone beneath her feet, sending a jolt of fear straight through her core. Her pulse raced, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps as the growl grew louder, closer, filling the cavern with its monstrous sound. She backed away, her body trembling as she tried to make sense of what was happening, tried to understand what kind of creature could make such a sound. The growl stopped abruptly, and in its place came the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, like something large, something inhuman, was moving toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her legs threatening to give out beneath her as she stumbled backward, her arms flailing in the darkness, trying to find something to hold on to, something to guide her out of this nightmare. But there was nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were almost on top of her. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the uneven stone floor, her hands outstretched to feel her way through the suffocating blackness. The sound of the footsteps followed her, relentless, echoing in the cavern like a death knell. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she ran blindly, her heart racing, her mind screaming for her to keep moving, to find a way out before it was too late. And then, without warning, she tripped. Her body hit the cold, hard ground with a sickening thud, the air rushing from her lungs as pain shot through her side. She gasped for breath, her vision swimming as she tried to push herself up, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if they were weighed down by an unseen force. The footsteps were closer now, so close she could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath her, each step sending a shiver of terror through her body. She crawled forward, her hands scraping against the rough stone, her heart pounding in her ears as the footsteps closed in. Desperation clawed at her insides as she reached out into the darkness, searching for anything that could help her escape. And then, her hand touched something cold. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as her fingers brushed against the smooth, icy surface of stone. But this wasn't just any stone. It was different. It was carved, shaped by human hands. Her heart raced as she felt along the surface, her fingers tracing strange, unfamiliar symbols etched into the rock.
A door.
It had to be a door. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed herself up, her hands fumbling for a handle, a latch, anything that could open the door and save her from the nightmare that was closing in on her. But there was nothing, just cold, unyielding stone. The footsteps stopped. Her breath hitched as she realized what that meant. Whatever was following her was right behind her now. She could feel its presence, looming over her like a dark shadow, its breath hot and rancid on the back of her neck. The girl's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with fear as she pressed herself against the stone door, her fingers desperately clawing at the surface, searching for a way out. But it was too late. The creature's hand, cold, clammy, and impossibly strong, wrapped around her wrist, pulling her away from the door with a force that nearly tore her arm from its socket. She screamed, her voice echoing through the chamber, but there was no one to hear her, no one to save her. And then, the voice came again, soft and sinister, like a whisper in the dark. "Welcome home, welcome home." The voice, soft yet bone-chilling, sent an icy wave of dread through her body. Her wrist, still gripped by that cold, unnatural hand, throbbed in pain as she tried to pull away. But there was no use. The grip tightened, holding her in place, as if the shadows themselves had become solid, living things. Her breath hitched, her chest heaving with terror as her heart pounded louder, faster, threatening to break free from her ribcage. A low rumble filled the air, the ground beneath her trembling as though the very cave itself was alive, pulsating with dark energy. The oppressive weight of the shadows pressed in on her, stealing the breath from her lungs, suffocating her. She gasped, her hands clawing at the cold stone door behind her, trying desperately to escape the grasp of the thing that held her captive. But the more she struggled, the tighter its grip became, pulling her deeper into the darkness. The creature's breath, hot and foul, ghosted over her skin, and she could feel its presence, looming, menacing, just inches from her face. She couldn't see it, but she knew it was there. She could sense its eyes watching her, could hear the soft, sickening rasp of its breath, like something unnatural, something that didn't belong in this world. Her mind raced, wild with fear. She had to get away. She had to find a way out before it was too late. But then the creature spoke again, its voice softer this time, almost a whisper, as if it were trying to lull her into a false sense of calm. Don't fight it. You've been chosen. Chosen? The word echoed in her mind, sending a fresh wave of terror surging through her veins. She didn't know what it meant, didn't want to know. All she knew was that she had to escape, now, before whatever it was planned to do to her happened. Her fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled along the surface of the door, desperately searching for any crack, any latch, any way to break free. But there was nothing, just cold, unyielding stone. The creature's grip loosened slightly, just enough for her to yank her hand free. She stumbled back, her heart racing as she darted into the darkness, her only guide the faint, distant flicker of light far, far ahead. The cave twisted and turned around her, the walls closing in, as though the very space was shifting, warping in response to her fear. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the chamber, a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding in her chest. The shadows seemed to move with her, growing darker, thicker, until she could barely see her own hands in front of her. But still she ran. She didn't dare stop. She couldn't. Behind her, the creature's footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, and far too close. Each step sent a shudder through the ground, vibrating in her bones, and she could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could hear it breathing now, that terrible, rasping sound, like the last gasps of a dying thing. It was getting closer. She could feel it, and then silence. The sudden stillness was more terrifying than the noise. The cave was utterly quiet, save for the sound of her own ragged breathing, her pulse thundering in her ears. She slowed her steps, her heart hammering in her chest as she turned, her eyes straining to see through the thick blackness that surrounded her. Nothing. The creature was gone. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed against the cold stone wall, her entire body trembling with fear and exhaustion. She gulped in deep breaths of the stale, musty air, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. She had to be dreaming. This had to be some kind of twisted nightmare. There was no other explanation. But the throbbing pain in her wrist, the icy chill that still clung to her skin, told her otherwise. This was real. Too real. She glanced down at her phone, hoping, praying, that somehow the battery hadn't completely died, that she could use its faint light to guide her out of this nightmare. But when she pressed the button, nothing happened. The screen remained dark, lifeless. Panic surged through her once more as the oppressive darkness pressed in on all sides. She couldn't stay here. She had to keep moving. But which way? The silence in the cave was deafening. Every tiny sound, the soft drip of water from the ceiling, the shuffle of her shoes on the stone floor, echoed loudly in her ears, amplifying her fear. She was alone in the dark, lost, and whatever had been chasing her was still out there, waiting. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. She had no choice but to keep going, to hope that somehow, by some miracle, she would find a way out before the creature found her again. She took a hesitant step forward, her hand skimming the rough stone wall for support. Her pulse quickened with every step she took, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. Every inch of her body was on high alert, her senses straining to pick up any sign of movement, any hint that the creature was still following her. But there was nothing, just the empty, echoing silence of the cave. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. Her blood ran cold as she froze in place, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was so faint, she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, the words dripping with malice. You can't escape. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she spun around, her eyes wide with terror. The whisper seemed to come from all directions at once, surrounding her, suffocating her. She stumbled backward, her back slamming against the cold stone wall. Her entire body trembled as she frantically searched the darkness for the source of the voice, her mind racing with panic. But there was nothing, just the endless black void of the cave. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound, trying to convince herself it wasn't real. But the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until it filled her head, drowning out all other thoughts. "You belong to us now." Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, her body trembling violently as the voice echoed in her mind, each word sending a fresh wave of terror coursing through her veins. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible as tears streamed down her face. "No, this can't be happening." But the voice only laughed, a low, sinister sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air around her. "It's already begun." The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed herself against the wall, her eyes darting frantically around the cave.
She didn't understand.
She didn't know what it wanted from her, why it was tormenting her like this. All she knew was that she had to get out. She forced herself to her feet, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion as she stumbled forward, her hands scraping along the rough stone walls for support. Her legs felt like lead, every step an effort, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her. But as she moved deeper into the cave, the voice followed her, taunting her with every step, whispering terrible things, things she didn't want to believe. "You'll never leave this place." Her heart raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the words echoed in her mind, filling her with dread. She didn't want to believe it, but the more she heard, the more real it became. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker, as if they were closing in on her, suffocating her, trapping her in this endless nightmare. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A flicker of movement. Her breath hitched in her throat as she spun around, her eyes wide with fear. But there was nothing, just the darkness, pressing in on all sides. She stumbled backward, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone, hoping against hope that somehow, some way, it would work. But when she pressed the button, the screen remained dark, lifeless. Panic surged through her as the voice came again, closer this time, a soft, malicious whisper that sent chills down her spine. "Don't fight it." Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her pulse racing with terror. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to escape. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, had to find a way out before it was too late. But the cave seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of darkness and shadows, with no end in sight. Her legs trembled beneath her, her entire body aching with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her. And then, without warning, she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. The soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing through the suffocating silence of the cave. Each step was like a heavy drumbeat, reverberating in her chest, shaking her to the core. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out all other sounds as the footsteps drew closer, each one louder, more menacing than the last. She couldn't move. Her legs were frozen in place, locked by fear, her body trembling as the darkness seemed to wrap itself around her, tightening its grip. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her throat constricted by the weight of her terror. She wanted to run, to scream, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of some unseen force. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right behind her. She could feel the presence of someone standing just inches away. The air around her grew cold, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into her skin, into her very bones. Her breath fogged in the air, her fingers numb as she clutched her phone, useless in her trembling hand. She didn't dare turn around. She didn't want to see what was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her. But then, the voice came again, soft and chilling, right in her ear. "Why are you running?" Her heart leapt into her throat, her entire body jerking with terror as the words washed over her. She could feel the breath of the speaker, cold and unnatural, brushing against her skin. It was so close, too close, and yet she couldn't see it. She couldn't see anything in the suffocating blackness that surrounded her. Tears welled in her eyes, her breath hitching in her chest as she squeezed her eyes shut, praying, hoping that this was all just a nightmare, that she would wake up any moment now, safe in her bed, far away from this terrible place. But she knew it wasn't a dream. She could feel the icy grip of reality pressing down on her, squeezing the breath from her lungs, stealing the strength from her legs. The voice laughed a low, sinister sound that sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through her veins. "You can't escape," it whispered, each word dripping with malice. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the cold, hard ground, her body trembling violently as she clutched her arms around herself, trying to hold herself together. The shadows seemed to close in on her, growing darker, more oppressive, until it felt like they were swallowing her whole. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words stuck in her throat, her voice lost in the suffocating silence of a cave. All she could do was sit there, shaking, as the voice continued to taunt her, filling her mind with fear. "You've been chosen," it said again, the words wrapping around her like a vice, squeezing the air from her lungs. "You belong to us now." Her heart raced, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as she tried to make sense of what was happening.
She didn't understand.
She didn't know what it wanted from her, why it was tormenting her like this. All she knew was that she had to get out. She had to escape before it was too late. With trembling hands, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs wobbling beneath her as she stumbled forward, blindly searching for a way out. The cave stretched on endlessly before her, the walls twisting and turning in an impossible maze. Every step she took felt like it was taking her deeper into the darkness, further away from any hope of escape. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her. Behind her, the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, following her through the cave. Each step sent a shiver down her spine, the sound echoing in her ears, growing louder with every passing second. She quickened her pace, her heart racing as she tried to put as much distance between herself and the thing that was following her. But no matter how fast she moved, the footsteps were always there, right behind her, relentless in their pursuit. The darkness pressed in on her, suffocating her, stealing her breath, her hope. She could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, heavier with each passing moment. It was as if the cave itself was alive, shifting and twisting around her, trapping her in its dark, twisted embrace. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, she heard it, a low, guttural growl, like the sound of an animal lurking in the darkness. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she froze in place, her entire body trembling with fear. The growl echoed through the cave, growing louder, closer, until it was all around her, surrounding her. She didn't know where it was coming from. She couldn't see anything in the thick, suffocating blackness that enveloped her. But she could feel it. Something was there, watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her pulse racing as she scanned the darkness, her eyes wide with terror. The growl grew louder, more menacing, until it felt like it was right in front of her, just inches away. And then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet shifted, the stone floor cracking and groaning as something massive stirred beneath the surface. The cave trembled, the walls shaking violently as the growl turned into a deafening roar, echoing through the chamber with bone-chilling intensity. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest as the floor gave way beneath her, a massive chasm opening up at her feet. She barely had time to react before she was falling, her arms flailing wildly as she plunged into the darkness below. The wind rushed past her, the cold air biting at her skin as she fell deeper and deeper into the void. Her heart raced, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the darkness swallowed her whole. And then nothing. For a moment, everything was silent.
Still.
She lay there in the darkness, her body aching from the fall, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. She didn't know how long she had been lying there, how far she had fallen. All she knew was that she was alone, trapped in the darkness, with no way out. But then, slowly, she became aware of something else. A presence. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, a faint tingling sensation at the back of her neck, like the feeling of being watched. But as the seconds ticked by, it grew stronger, more intense, until it was impossible to ignore. Something was there. Something was watching her. She struggled to her feet, her body trembling with fear as she scanned the darkness, her eyes straining to see anything in the suffocating blackness that surrounded her. But there was nothing, just the endless void, stretching on in all directions. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she backed away, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't know what it was, didn't want to know. All she knew was that she had to get away. But as she turned to run, the presence grew stronger, closer, until it was right behind her. She could feel it, could feel its cold breath on the back of her neck, could hear the soft, whispering voice that sent chills down her spine. "You can't escape." Her heart leapt into her throat, her breath hitching in her chest as she stumbled forward, her legs trembling beneath her. The voice was so close, too close, and yet she couldn't see it. She couldn't see anything in the suffocating blackness that enveloped her. But she knew it was there, watching her, waiting for her to make a move. The ground beneath her trembled again, a low rumble shaking the floor as the voice grew louder, more insistent. "You belong to us now." Tears streamed down her face as she ran, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as she stumbled through the darkness. The cave seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of shadows and stone, with no end in sight. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her. Behind her, the voice laughed, a low, sinister sound that echoed through the chamber, filling her with dread. There's no way out. Her legs burned with exhaustion, her chest heaving as she pushed herself to keep going, to keep running. But the voice was right. There was no way out. No matter how far she ran, no matter how fast she moved, she was trapped. The darkness pressed in on her, suffocating her, stealing her breath. The walls seemed to close in, growing tighter, more oppressive with each passing moment. It was as if the cave itself was alive, feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every step she took. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, she saw it. A flicker of light. Her heart skipped a beat, hope surging through her veins as she stumbled toward the light, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She didn't know where it led, didn't care. All she knew was that it was her only chance, her only hope of escape. But as she drew closer, the light flickered, dimming, until it was barely visible in the thick, suffocating blackness that surrounded her. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "No, please." But the light continued to flicker, like a dying ember in the depths of her despair, fading before her very eyes. "No, please," she whispered again, her voice trembling, thin as the thread of hope she clung to. Her legs moved instinctively, stumbling over jagged rocks, her breath shallow and broken. But no matter how fast she ran, the light kept pulling away from her, receding deeper into the shadows like a cruel trick. It dangled just out of reach, an illusion, a taunt. And just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone, snuffed out, leaving her in total, suffocating blackness once more. Terror swallowed her whole, a yawning void inside her chest that mirrored the cave's cold embrace. She spun around, her heart pounding in her ears, her hands reaching out to touch something, anything, but all she felt was empty space, endless and eternal. The walls seemed to shift, closing in, tightening their grip, until it felt like they were pressing against her very skin. She was trapped. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving, the weight of the air growing heavier, thicker, like she was breathing in the darkness itself. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take any more, the voice returned. A soft, low whisper, curling around her like smoke. "You cannot run from me." The words slid into her mind like a cold blade, sending shivers down her spine. She stumbled backward, her legs trembling, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst.
From her chest. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. And then the laughter came. It was faint at first, a distant, echoing sound, like the wind howling through a forgotten graveyard. But it grew louder, sharper, until it filled the cave, bouncing off the stone walls, surrounding her, suffocating her. It was laughter without joy, laughter full of malice, as though the darkness itself was mocking her. Her pulse quickened, panic clawing at her insides. She turned in every direction, trying to find the source of the sound, but it was everywhere and nowhere all at once, taunting her from the shadows. She clutched her arms around her body, as if she could protect herself from whatever was coming. But deep down, she knew there was nothing she could do. And then she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, something moved, a shadow within the shadows, shifting and writhing like a living thing. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, as the shape emerged from the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form twisted and unnatural, like a grotesque figure carved from the very rock of the cave. Its limbs were long and spindly, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that made her skin crawl. And its face, if you could call it a face, was a mass of swirling shadows, eyes like hollow voids that seemed to drink in the light. She couldn't scream. The sound was caught in her throat, trapped by the crushing weight of fear. She backed away, her heart slamming against her ribs, but the creature followed her, its long, bony fingers reaching out toward her. She stumbled over a loose rock, falling hard onto the cold stone floor, pain shooting up her leg. But she didn't care. All that mattered was the thing looming over her, its hollow eyes locked on her, its fingers curling in the air like the talons of a predator. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her entire body trembling. The creature moved closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate, each one echoing in the silent cave like a death knell. And then it spoke. "I've been waiting for you." Its voice was deep, ancient, as though it had been trapped in the cave for centuries, its words dripping with malice. The sound of it sent a chill through her entire body, freezing her blood in her veins. She could feel its presence closing in on her, suffocating her, as though the darkness itself was reaching out to claim her. Her pulse raced, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of panic. She couldn't think, couldn't move. The only thing she could do was stare into the creature's empty, hollow eyes and wait for whatever was coming. But then, just as the creature's fingers were about to brush against her skin, there was a flash of light, a bright, searing light that filled the cave, blinding her, burning away the shadows. The creature recoiled, hissing in fury, its form flickering and twisting as though the light itself was tearing it apart. It let out a guttural scream, the sound vibrating through the air, shaking the walls of the cave. And then in an instant, it was gone, dissolved into the darkness, leaving her alone in the blinding light. She lay there for a moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her body trembling from the shock of it all. She didn't know what had just happened, didn't know where the light had come from, or why the creature had disappeared. All she knew was that she was still alive. And then she heard it, a faint voice, soft, gentle, calling her name. She blinked, squinting against the light, trying to see where the voice was coming from. But there was nothing, just the endless white, stretching on in all directions. "Come to me," the voice said again, more insistent this time. It sounded familiar, comforting, like the voice of someone she had known long ago. But she couldn't place it. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her as she took a step forward, drawn toward the sound. The light shifted, dimming slightly, and for the first time, she could make out a figure standing in the distance. It was hazy, blurred, but she could see the outline of a person, tall, slender, their arms outstretched as if waiting for her. Her heart skipped a beat, a strange sense of déjà vu washing over her. She knew this person. She had seen them before in a dream or maybe a memory buried deep in her subconscious. She took another step, her breath hitching in her chest. The figure grew clearer, more defined, until she could make out their features. Her heart raced, her mind reeling as recognition hit her like a tidal wave. It was Tom, her best friend Tom, who had died all those years ago. She froze, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. It couldn't be him. It wasn't possible. He was gone, buried in the ground, lost to her forever. But there he was, standing before her, his eyes full of sadness, his hand outstretched as if beckoning her to come closer. "Jake," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've been waiting for you." Tears welled in her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him and never let go. But something held her back, something deep inside her, a voice whispering in the back of her mind that this wasn't right, that this wasn't real. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Tom?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" He nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I never left, Jake. I've always been here, waiting for you to come back." Her mind spun, confusion and fear warring within her. She didn't understand. How could he be here, in this place, after all these years? It didn't make sense. But before she could say anything else, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. She looked down, her breath catching in her throat as cracks appeared in the stone, spreading out in jagged lines, radiating from her feet. The tremors grew stronger, the ground shaking violently beneath her, and then, without warning, the floor gave way. She screamed, her arms flailing as she fell into the darkness once more. The wind rushing past her, her heart slamming against her ribs. And then she hit the ground. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, pain radiating through her entire body as she lay there, gasping for air. Her vision swam, the world spinning around her as she struggled to make sense of what had just happened. But when she looked up, everything was different. The cave was gone. The darkness, the shadows, the suffocating weight of fear, it was all gone. Instead, she was lying on soft grass, the scent of earth and pine filling her lungs. She pushed herself up, her body aching, and looked around. She was in a forest. The trees loomed tall and ancient around her, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was cool and crisp, the sky above a pale, twilight blue. It was peaceful, serene, but something was wrong. The air felt heavy, thick with a strange, unsettling energy. And then she saw them, figures, moving through the trees, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke. They were human, or at least they had been once. But now they were something else, something dark and twisted, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow and empty. They moved slowly, deliberately, like they were searching for something or someone. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away, her heart racing. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away, her heart racing. The figures swayed with unnatural grace, their hollow eyes reflecting nothing but a void, a darkness that reached beyond the world she had known. Each movement they made was soundless, like specters drifting through the misty woods, neither alive nor dead, as if the very air between the trees had given them form. Her skin prickled, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end, as if the forest itself was watching her, holding its breath. She could feel the weight of their gaze. Though their eyes were empty, she could feel it, burrowing into her soul, unrelenting. The pressure was unbearable, like invisible hands pressing against her chest, squeezing tighter with each passing second. And then, without warning, one of them turned its head toward her, a face pale and gaunt, with skin stretched tight over brittle bones, cracked lips frozen in a silent scream. Its eyes, voids of nothingness, locked onto her with terrifying precision. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by an overwhelming terror that gripped her from within, like icy fingers wrapped around her throat, squeezing until she could barely breathe. Suddenly, the figure's mouth opened wide, a gaping, black abyss that seemed to stretch impossibly far, far beyond the boundaries of what was human. From that chasm came a sound, a low, guttural wail, like the groan of 1,000 lost souls, rising and falling in waves, filling the air with its haunting melody. It echoed through the trees, reverberating in her bones, shaking her to her core. Her legs refused to move, rooted to the spot as the figures began to drift closer, their twisted bodies undulating like smoke in the wind. They glided silently over the ground, their arms outstretched, skeletal fingers curling as if reaching for her, beckoning her into the depths of their endless despair. "Run!" A voice screamed in her mind, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the forest itself had trapped her in place, holding her captive in the clutches of these unnatural beings. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she was locked in a nightmare from which there was no escape. One of the figures, closer now, reached out, its bony fingers brushing against her arm. The touch was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt before, like death itself had made contact with her skin. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart hammered in her chest as the cold spread through her body, seeping into her bones, her muscles, her veins. It whispered to her, a soft, rasping voice, barely audible over the beating of her own heart. Words she couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear. It wanted her. It wanted to take her, to drag her into the darkness where she would never escape, never return. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. She could feel it, shifting, shaking, as if the earth itself was about to crack open and swallow her whole. And still, the figures came closer, their eyes fixed on her, their mouths twisted in grotesque shapes, mouthing words she couldn't comprehend. A single tear slipped from her eye, sliding down her cheek as she fought to break free from the invisible chains that held her. But the cold, the darkness, it was all too much. She was drowning in it, sinking deeper into the void with each passing second. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her shoulder. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned, expecting to see one of the twisted figures standing behind her. But it wasn't. It was Tom. He was there, solid and real, his face pale but familiar, his eyes wide with urgency. "We have to go," he said, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the fog of terror that had gripped her. "Now!" Without waiting for her response, he yanked her arm, pulling her with him as they broke into a run. Her legs, stiff and numb with fear, struggled to keep up, but the adrenaline surged through her veins, driving her forward. She stumbled over roots and rocks, the forest floor uneven and treacherous beneath her feet. But Tom never let go of her, guiding her through the trees as if he knew exactly where to go. Behind them, the figures gave chase. Their movements were swift now, no longer the slow, drifting approach from before. They moved with unnatural speed, their bodies twisting and contorting in impossible ways, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their mouths wide open, the wails of despair rising into a cacophony of horror. The forest around them blurred, the trees whipping past in a dizzying rush. Branches scratched at her arms, tearing at her clothes, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The only thing that mattered was getting away from them, escaping the nightmare that had swallowed her whole. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning as she pushed herself to keep running. Tom's grip on her arm the only thing anchoring her to reality. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the forest groaning as if it, too, was alive, shifting and changing with each step they took. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. They broke through the edge of the forest, stumbling out into a clearing bathed in the pale light of the moon. The air was cold, biting against her skin, but it was real. She could feel it, breathe it. The oppressive weight of the force of the figures was gone. For a moment, she and Tom stood there, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from the exertion. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, the echo of the wails ringing in her ears, but there was a strange silence around them now, a calm that felt almost surreal. She turned to Tom, her voice barely above a whisper. What were those things?" He shook his head, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight with fear. "But we're not safe here. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say a word, the ground beneath them began to shift again. The earth trembled, cracking open in jagged lines, the ground splitting beneath their feet. She screamed, stumbling backward as the cracks widened, the earth yawning open like a hungry mouth. And from the darkness below, she could hear them again. The wails, the cries of the twisted figures, rising up from the depths. "We have to go," Tom shouted, grabbing her hand once more. But it was too late. The ground gave way beneath them, and they plunged into the darkness, falling, deeper into the abyss. The cold air rushed past her, her screams swallowed by the void. It felt like an eternity, like they were descending into the very heart of the earth, swallowed by the same darkness that had haunted her since the moment she entered that cursed cave. And then, with a bone-jarring impact, they hit the ground. The pain shot through her body like fire, radiating from every limb, every joint. She lay there for a moment, dazed and disoriented, the world spinning around her in a blur of darkness and confusion. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up, her body aching with the effort. She was in a cavern, another cave, but different from the one before. The walls were smooth, polished, almost reflective, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. Tom was beside her, groaning in pain as he struggled to his feet. He looked as shaken as she felt, his face pale and drawn, but he was alive. They were both alive. For now. "We need to keep moving," Tom said, his voice hoarse. He was already looking around, scanning the cavern for a way out. She nodded, her throat too tight with fear to speak. She didn't know what was happening, didn't know how they had ended up here, but she trusted Tom. He had saved her before, and he would save her again. They moved slowly, cautiously, through the cavern, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural light, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. And though the figures from the forest were nowhere to be seen, she could feel their presence, an invisible weight pressing down on her, a cold shiver that crawled up her spine. As they ventured deeper into the cave, the air grew colder, and the walls began to close in around them, narrowing until they were forced to walk single file, squeezing through tight passages barely wide enough to fit through. The claustrophobia was suffocating, the darkness pressing in on all sides. But they kept going, driven by the same primal fear that had pushed them through the forest. And then, without warning, the passage opened up into a vast chamber. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat as she looked around. The chamber was enormous, the ceiling so high it disappeared into the darkness above. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, ancient and crumbling, covered in strange symbols and carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light. The air was thick with the smell of blood and decay, and she could hear a faint, rhythmic sound, a low, throbbing hum that seemed to vibrate through the very stone beneath their feet. It was a heartbeat. Her heart pounded in time with the sound, an overwhelming sense of dread washing over her. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the altar, the dark stone flickering under the strange glow of the symbols carved into it. The rhythmic pulse, that terrible heartbeat, seemed to grow louder with each second, reverberating through her body like a living thing, crawling beneath her skin. Tom stood beside her, his breath shallow and ragged. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. For the first time, she saw the cracks in his courage, the fear that had been clawing at him as much as it had her. His hand tightened around hers, his grip cold and shaking, as if he, too, could feel the malevolent force that radiated from the altar. A shiver passed through her, starting at the nape of her neck and spiraling down her spine. The room was unbearably cold now, the air thick with an unholy presence. She didn't want to move, didn't want to take another step closer, but her feet seemed to betray her, dragging her toward the altar. Something deep inside her whispered, "No," screamed, that she shouldn't be here, that she needed to turn and run. But she was frozen, helpless, captivated by the dreadful allure of whatever lay within that ancient stone. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and then, without warning, the ground beneath the altar began to tremble. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, a deep, guttural sound that shook the very walls. Dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling as the earth quaked beneath their feet, but neither she nor Tom moved. They were rooted to the spot, trapped in the clutches of the force that had gripped them since they had stumbled into this cursed place. And then, from the shadows beyond the altar, something moved. At first, it was just a flicker, barely noticeable, a ripple of darkness against darkness. But then, the movement grew stronger, more pronounced. The shadows seemed to coalesce, swirling and writhing, taking on a form that was both formless and all too real. She could feel it before she saw it. The cold, creeping sensation of being watched, of being hunted. The air around them seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if the darkness itself was alive, breathing, pressing down on them from all sides. Her breath hitched in her throat as she saw the thing emerge from the shadows. It was enormous, towering above the altar, its shape twisting and shifting like smoke in the wind. Its body was a mass of writhing, black tendrils, slick and shimmering, coiling around themselves like serpents. And its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were two burning orbs of crimson, glowing with a malevolent light that seemed to pierce through the darkness and into her soul. It opened its mouth, though she couldn't tell where its mouth was, or if it even had one, and from it came a sound, a low, guttural growl, like the grinding of stones, the screeching of metal on metal. The sound echoed through the chamber, filling her ears, her mind, with its terrible resonance. Her legs gave way beneath her. She fell to her knees, her body trembling, her heart racing with a terror so profound she thought she might die from it. Tom knelt beside her, his face twisted in horror as he stared up at the monstrous figure. He was trying to say something, his lips moving, but the words were lost in the cacophony of the creature's growls and the relentless pounding of that infernal heartbeat. The creature moved closer, its tendrils reaching out toward them, curling and uncurling like fingers grasping for prey. Each step it took sent a wave of cold air rushing over them, a chill that burrowed deep into their bones, freezing them from the inside out. She wanted to scream, but her voice had abandoned her. She could only watch in silent terror as the thing drew nearer. Its crimson eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The closer it came, the more the air seemed to crackle with energy, a dark, oppressive force that pressed down on her chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. Tom grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight, his eyes wide with desperation. "We have to move," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the creature's presence. But she couldn't move. Her body felt heavy, paralyzed by the weight of the fear that gripped her. The creature's tendrils reached out, hovering just inches from her face. She could feel the cold radiating from them, see the way they shimmered with an oily, unnatural sheen. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest as the tendrils inched closer, closer. And then, something snapped. Tom let out a strangled cry, jerking her to her feet with a strength she didn't know he had. "Run!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and raw with panic. They bolted, sprinting toward the far end of the chamber, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound so loud it rattled her bones, but she didn't dare look back. She could hear it behind them, its massive body moving with a speed that defied its size, its tendrils slithering across the floor like snakes, scraping against the stone with a terrible screeching sound. Her lungs burned as they ran, the cold air searing her throat with every breath. Her legs felt weak, her muscles screaming in protest, but the fear driving her forward was stronger than the pain. They had to get out. They had to escape before the creature caught up with them, before it consumed them in its darkness. They reached the far wall of the chamber, where a narrow passageway beckoned. Tom shoved her through first, his hands shaking as he pushed her toward the exit. She stumbled into the passage, the walls closing in around her as she squeezed through the tight space. Tom followed close behind, But the creature was relentless, its massive form crashing through the chamber behind them, shaking the ground with each step. The passage was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for them to fit through. The walls were cold and slick with moisture, and the darkness was so thick it felt like a physical presence, pressing in on them from all sides. But they kept moving, their breath ragged and labored, their bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. The creature was still behind them, its growls echoing through the passage, its tendrils scraping against the walls. As it pursued them, the air was thick with the stench of decay, the smell of rot and death clinging to the walls, seeping into their clothes, their skin. Her vision blurred, her mind clouded with exhaustion and terror. She could barely think, barely focus on anything other than the need to keep moving, to keep running. But with each step, the passage seemed to narrow further, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter until she could hardly breathe. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She let out a startled scream as she tumbled forward, her body pitching into a steep decline. The world spun around her as she fell, her hands scraping against the jagged rocks, the air rushing past her in a whirlwind of sound and motion. Tom's voice echoed behind her, shouting her name, but she couldn't see him, couldn't focus on anything other than the terrifying sensation of free falling through the darkness. Her body slammed into the ground with a bone-jarring impact, the air knocked from her lungs in a painful rush. For a moment, she lay there, dazed and disoriented, her head spinning. She could hear the creature above her, its growls growing fainter, but she knew it was still there, still hunting them. Tom landed beside her with a thud, his body crumpling to the ground. He groaned in pain, but he was alive. They were both alive. She pushed herself up on shaky arms, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They had landed in another chamber, smaller than the one above, but just as foreboding. The walls were covered in the same strange, glowing symbols, and the air was thick with an oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. We have to keep moving," Tom rasped, struggling to his feet. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but he was determined. He reached out to help her up, his hand cold and trembling. As she stood, she realized with a sinking dread that the passage they had fallen through had sealed itself behind them. There was no way back. "We're trapped," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heartbeat. Tom shook his head, his expression grim. "No, there has to be another way." But as they looked around, the oppressive darkness seemed to close in on them, swallowing them whole. There was no light, no warmth, no escape, only the cold, endless night, and the terrible sense that they were not alone. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her, though it did little to ward off the chill that had seeped into her bones. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the unmistakable stench of death hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. And then, from the far end of the chamber, she heard it, a sound, soft at first, barely a whisper. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire chamber, echoing off the walls in a haunting, rhythmic chant. Her heart raced, her breath filled with a desperate urgency, clawing its way into her chest, threatening to burst free. The chant, an ancient, sorrowful melody, seemed to wrap around her, a ghostly embrace that pulled her closer to the shadows at the chamber's edge. Tom's grip tightened on her hand, anchoring her to reality. But even his presence felt fragile against the overwhelming darkness that pulsated around them. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He nodded, his face drawn tight with fear. "It sounds alive." The sound grew louder, resonating with a chilling beauty that sent shivers down her spine. It seemed to beckon them, urging them to step forward, to give in to the lure of the shadows. But in that moment of entrancing melody, she saw flashes of what lay beyond, the cold, clammy grasp of the darkness that had devoured countless souls before them. "Don't listen to it," Tom said, his voice low, almost a growl. "We need to fight it." But the more they struggled against the enchanting chant, the more it wrapped around them, binding them with invisible threads. Shadows danced at the edges of the chamber, flickering like the distant memories of those who had come before, whispering secrets of despair and longing. She could almost see them, faces twisted in agony, eyes pleading for release, as if they were warning her of the fate that awaited them. The floor beneath them began to pulse in time with the chant, sending ripples of darkness sweeping through the chamber. She felt a strange tug at her core, as though the ground itself was reaching for her, eager to pull her down into the depths of its cold embrace. "No!" she gasped, stumbling backward, dragging Tom with her. But it was too late. The shadows surged forward, a tide of despair crashing against their bodies. She could feel the icy fingers of the darkness brush against her skin, creeping beneath her clothes, invading her very essence. A scream clawed at her throat, but the sound was swallowed by the growing roar of the chant, drowning out everything else. The walls began to close in around them, the symbols glowing brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat, drawing power from their fear. Shadows coiled around her legs, pulling her down, binding her to the floor, and she fought with every ounce of strength she had left. Tom was beside her, wrestling against the tendrils of darkness that sought to ensnare him, but he, too, was faltering, his resolve cracking under the pressure of the overwhelming force. "Lily," he shouted, panic rising in his voice. "We have to." Before he could finish, the shadows surged forward, enveloping them both in a swirling vortex of darkness. She could feel her consciousness slipping, like sand through an hourglass, as the shadows consumed her mind, pulling her into their depths. The chant rose to a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of wails and whispers, drowning out her thoughts, her screams, her very being. The last thing she saw was Tom's face, etched with fear, his eyes wide as he reached for her, the distance between them stretching like an abyss. She felt his hand slip from hers, the connection severed, and in that moment, she understood the terrible truth. The darkness would take him too, just as it had taken so many before. And then, everything went black. In the void, time lost all meaning. She floated in a state of nothingness, a dreamless slumber wrapped in cold silence. It felt like an eternity, each heartbeat echoing in the hollow expanse of her mind. Then, slowly, the darkness began to recede, like a tide pulling away from the shore. Images flickered to life. Memories, perhaps, or illusions spun from the threads of her imagination. She saw the old town, the familiar streets bathed in twilight, the warm glow of lights flickering in the windows of quaint cottages. She heard the laughter of children, the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the simple joys of life. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, a sense of peace washing over her. But then, like a shadow eclipsing the sun, the darkness returned. The laughter twisted into cries, the glow turned sinister, and the children's faces morphed into the anguished expression she had seen in the chamber. Panic surged through her as the memory became a nightmare, engulfing her in its cold embrace once more. "Tom!" she screamed, desperation clawing at her throat. "Where are you?" The shadows shifted, swirling around her like a storm. She felt their presence, felt them reaching out, eager to ensnare her in their depths. But deep within, a flicker of hope ignited, a spark that refused to be extinguished. She remembered Tom, his face etched in her mind, his courage in the face of the impossible. "Tom!" she called again, her voice stronger. "This time, we can't let it take us." With those words, something shifted within her, a swell of determination rising against the tide of despair. The shadows recoiled, momentarily retreating, as if they could feel her willpower pushing against their encroaching darkness. She could hear the chant once more, but this time it felt distant, the words losing their power over her as she fought to break free. And then, a light flickered in the distance, soft, warm, and inviting. It pulsed gently, illuminating the shadows that had surrounded her, casting them away like smoke in the wind. She stumbled toward it, drawn by its glow, a beacon in the heart of the darkness. As she moved closer, She saw Tom emerging from the shadows, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. He was struggling against the tendrils of darkness that clung to him, but she could see the light in his eyes, a spark of hope igniting against the overwhelming odds. "Lily," he shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. "I thought I lost you." "Not yet," she cried, reaching out to him. She felt the warmth of their connection pulse between them, a tether of strength that defied the darkness. They ran toward each other, the shadows swirling violently around them, but they pushed through, hearts pounding, determined to break free. As they collided in a desperate embrace, the shadows recoiled, howling in frustration, their grip loosening. Together, they faced the encroaching darkness, their breaths mingling as they fought against the oppressive force that sought to consume them. The chant rose to a deafening crescendo once more, echoing in their ears, but this time they drowned it out with their voices. "Together," Tom shouted, his eyes fierce and resolute. "Together," she echoed, her heart swelling with newfound courage. The darkness writhed and twisted around them, but they stood firm, holding on to each other as they focused on a light that glowed just beyond the shadows. With each heartbeat, they forged a path, their determination igniting the spark within, pushing against the shadows with every ounce of strength they had left. And then, in a final burst of energy, they surged forward, breaking free from the dark tendrils that had ensnared them. The shadows screamed, a cacophony of rage and despair, as the light enveloped them both, consuming the darkness in its warm embrace. As the light surged, she felt the shadows dissolving around her, the chilling whispers fading into nothingness. The pain that had gripped her heart, the fear that had threatened to overwhelm her, fell away like ash, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. And then, suddenly, they were outside. The cool night air rushed against her skin, vibrant and alive. Stars sparkled overhead, illuminating the quiet beauty of the world around them. The town lay before them, tranquil and serene, as if the darkness had never touched it at all. "Did we make it?" Tom breathed, looking around in disbelief. She squeezed his hand, her heart soaring. "I think we did." They stood there for a moment, the weight of their experience pressing down on them. But the warmth of the light lingered, a reminder that they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The bond between them felt stronger than ever, forged in the fires of terror and tempered by courage. But as they turned to leave, a shadow flickered at the edge of their vision, just beyond the light. A chill crept down her spine as she turned back, her breath hitching in her throat. The shadows were not entirely gone. "Tom," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. But before she could finish, the shadow surged forward, twisting and writhing as it took shape. The creature loomed before them, its crimson eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. "No!" Tom shouted, pulling her back against him, shielding her from the oncoming darkness. They stood together, united, facing the terror that had pursued them through the depths of the night. She could feel the pulse of fear rising in her chest, but she refused to back down. They had fought through the shadows before. They could do it again. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice steady as she looked into Tom's eyes, grounding herself in his presence. "Always," he replied, his determination echoing in her heart. The darkness surged forward, tendrils reaching out toward them, but this time, they were ready. Together, they summoned the light within them, the warmth of their bond igniting a fire that pushed back against the encroaching shadows. As the creature lunged, they stood firm, channeling their combined strength into a blinding light that burst forth, illuminating into the suffocating darkness. The light surged forth like a tidal wave, illuminating the shadows that clung to the corners of the world, chasing them away with its radiant glow. The creature halted in its tracks, its twisted form flickering in the brightness, momentarily stunned as if the light had pierced through the veil of its malevolence. Tom and Lily stood resolute, their hearts pounding in tandem, fueled by an unyielding determination to fight for their survival. The bond between them pulsed with warmth, a shield against the encroaching terror. "Now!" Tom shouted, and in that instant, they pushed forward together, hands clasped tight, forging a path through the darkness. The shadows writhed in defiance, their whispers turning into wails of rage as they struggled against the encroaching light. The creature howled, a chilling sound that echoed through the night, resonating with the pain and anguish of countless lost souls. It lunged toward them, a whirlwind of dark fury, but they held their ground, channeling every ounce of courage they possessed into the blinding light that erupted from within. "Stay close," Lily urged, her voice a beacon amidst the chaos. They pressed on, the light engulfing them, illuminating the twisted visage of the creature as it recoiled in fear. The light was their ally, a living force that surged around them, pushing back against the darkness, reclaiming the space that had been lost to despair. As they drew nearer, the creature's form began to dissolve, the shadows shedding like old skin, revealing glimpses of the faces it had consumed. Each visage was a haunting echo of lost hopes and dreams, trapped in the shadows for eternity. Fear gnawed at her heart, but she refused to falter. "Let them go," she cried, her voice ringing out, infused with an intensity that surprised even herself. "You can't keep them here." The light intensified, and for a fleeting moment, she could see the remnants of lost souls, their eyes wide with a mix of hope and despair. They looked to her, to Tom, their silent pleas reverberating through the air, urging them on. With newfound strength, they surged forward, the light expanding until it filled the entire chamber. The creature shrieked, a sound that was part rage, part despair as it writhed and twisted, desperate to escape the onslaught of warmth and light. "Together," Tom shouted, his voice carrying through the din. "Together," Lily echoed, the words igniting a fire within her, a promise of strength and unity. As they pressed onward, the light burst forth in a magnificent explosion, a brilliant display of hope that flooded the chamber. Shadows shattered like glass, scattering into the night, the whispers falling silent as the faces of the lost were freed, swirling around them in a flurry of ethereal light. But the creature was not finished yet. In one final, desperate attempt, it lunged at them, its claws extended, dark tendrils stretching outward, seeking to ensnare them in its grip. Lily felt a surge of fear as the darkness wrapped around her ankles, a chilling reminder of the depths they had just escaped. "No!" Tom yelled, pulling her back, but the shadows were relentless, their grip tightening around her, dragging her down toward the abyss. "Fight it, Lily," he urged, desperation flooding his voice. With all her strength, she closed her eyes and summoned the warmth of their bond, the love that had fueled their journey through the darkness. "I won't let you take me," she cried, her voice ringing out like a clarion call. As if in response, the light flared brighter, a sunburst of brilliance that filled the chamber, casting the shadows into retreat. With a final push, she extended her hand toward the creature, feeling the warmth radiate from within. "Be free!" she shouted, and in that moment, the light exploded, engulfing the creature in a wave of radiant energy. The darkness screamed, a terrible sound that echoed through the night as the light enveloped it, consuming the shadows whole. The wails of the lost souls resonated in the air, mingling with the creature's cries. A symphony of despair turned into liberation. Lily felt the shadows dissolve around her, the cold grip releasing its hold as the warmth enveloped her entirely. The last remnants of darkness evaporated, leaving behind only a glimmer of starlight, flickering gently in the air. And then silence. They stood together in the aftermath, hearts racing, breathing in the cool night air, the stars shining above them like diamonds against a velvet sky. The weight of their ordeal hung heavy in the air, but the warmth of their bond anchored them, a reminder that they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. "I can't believe we did it," Tom breathed, his voice filled with awe. Lily nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and relief. We were strong together. That's what mattered. But as they turned to leave, the remnants of the darkness still lingered at the edges of their vision, a reminder of what they had faced. The The faces of the lost flashed before her once more, their eyes wide with a mix of relief and sorrow. "Will they be okay?" she whispered, her heart aching for those who had been trapped. Tom took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We freed them from the shadows. They'll find peace now." As they stepped into the cool night, the weight of the darkness began to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. The old town lay before them, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, its familiar streets inviting them home. But as they walked, an unsettling feeling crept into her heart, a whisper of doubt that tugged at the edges of her mind. What if the darkness returned? What if it came back to reclaim what it had lost? "Tom?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he replied, glancing back at her. "What if it never really leaves?" He paused, his expression thoughtful. "We faced it, Lily. We fought for our lives and for the lives of those who were lost. That counts for something. Does it?" she asked, her heart heavy with uncertainty. He stepped closer, his gaze piercing and resolute. "It does. As long as we remember what we fought for, we can carry that light with us. It's a part of us now." She nodded, the flicker of hope reigniting in her chest. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, bound together by their shared experience. But the unease lingered, a shadow at the back of her mind, a reminder of the terror they had faced. The memories of the lost souls flashed before her, their faces etched in her memory. "Lily, look," Tom said suddenly, pointing toward the horizon. She followed his gaze, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a sliver of dawn breaking through the darkness, bathing the world in soft, golden light. "It's beautiful," she whispered, awestruck by the sight. "It is," Tom agreed, taking her hand once more. Together, they walked toward the rising sun, leaving the remnants of darkness behind. With each step, the warmth of the light enveloped them, a reminder that they were not alone. But as they stepped into the new day, she could still feel the echoes of the past whispering in the wind, a chilling reminder of the shadows that lay just beyond the light. The journey may have ended, but the scars of their encounter would linger, a testament to their bravery and resilience. And as they ventured forth side by side, she understood that they would carry the weight of their experience with them, a reminder of the darkness that had sought to consume them, and the light that had saved them. For every shadow cast by the sun, there is a balance, light and dark entwined, forever locked in a dance as old as time. And while they had emerged from the shadows, she knew the darkness would always lurk at the edges of their lives, waiting for the moment of vulnerability to strike again. But in that realization lay their strength. They would face the shadows together, armed with the light that burned brightly within them, the bond they had forged in the crucible of fear. With each passing day, they would remember the journey that had brought them here, the darkness they had faced, and the light that had guided them home. And together, they would ensure that the shadows would never again claim another soul, standing watch against the darkness that sought to encroach upon their lives. As the sun rose higher in the sky, they stepped into the light, their hearts entwined, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would navigate the winding paths of life, bound by love, illuminated by hope, and forever vigilant against the shadows that whispered in the night. In that shared promise, they found strength, a beacon against the encroaching dark, and the assurance that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. With hope burning in their hearts and the light guiding their way, they would forge ahead, embracing each moment as a gift, each memory as a blessing, and every challenge as an opportunity to grow. For even in the face of darkness, love would always be their guiding light, a flame that could never be extinguished, illuminating the path ahead. And so, as the dawn broke fully over the horizon, painting the world in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, they ventured forth into the unknown, united in purpose, ready to embrace whatever adventures awaited them. The darkness howled, a wailing chorus of despair and fury, as the tendrils recoiled, momentarily stunned by the radiant force they unleashed. It was a brilliant light, born from the deepest corners of their souls, a manifestation of hope courage, and an unwavering bond that had survived the darkest of trials. The creature writhed, its form shifting and distorting in the blinding glow, its crimson eyes narrowing as if trying to pierce the veil of light that now surrounded them. The shadows that clung to it flickered and danced, a reflection of the torment it embodied, a being formed from the fears and regrets of those it had consumed. Yet, in that moment, it seemed to falter, the strength of their unity pushing it back, forcing it to confront the brilliance they had conjured. "Together, Lily," Tom shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon, urging her to hold on to the light. "Together," she echoed, feeling the warmth of their connection surge through her. She focused on the creature, willing it to see the truth of their bond, the strength that came from facing the darkness hand in hand. The light pulsed around them, radiant and fierce, and she could feel it mingling with their shared memories, the laughter of their childhood, the whispers of dreams yet to be fulfilled, the love that had blossomed even in the shadows. As the creature lunged forward, the light exploded outward, a dazzling wave that consumed everything in its path. The darkness writhed and twisted, trying to reclaim its hold, but it was too late. The warmth enveloped the night, bathing the scene in ethereal brilliance, illuminating the world in hues of gold and silver. "Feel it," she urged, feeling the energy swell within her, a fire igniting that pushed back the encroaching shadows. "We're stronger together," the creature shrieked, a sound that echoed through the air, a mix of fury and desperation that chilled her bones. It was a primal cry, reverberating with a lifetime of pain and loss, a testament to all the souls it had devoured. But in its cries, she sensed a flicker of doubt, a crack in the facade of its malevolence. "Tom, we can do this," she shouted, determination surging within her. "We can banish it back into the darkness." "Let's show it what love can do," he replied, a fierce fire igniting in his eyes. They stepped forward, their hands clasped tightly, and the light erupted from them in a brilliant burst, a radiant sphere that pulsed with life and energy. The creature hesitated, its crimson eyes flickering as it realized the strength of the bond before it. The tendrils of shadow that had once wrapped around it began to falter, slipping away like water through cupped hands. With every heartbeat, the light grew brighter, a beacon that illuminated the night and filled the air with warmth. The darkness hissed, recoiling as it pressed against the brilliance, desperate to reclaim its dominion. But they stood resolute, their connection unbreakable, their love a shield against the despair that threatened to engulf them. Together they shouted, their voices harmonizing, melding into a single powerful force that surged forth like a tidal wave. The creature roared, a sound of pure rage, and lunged at them one last time, its twisted form blurring into a mass of shadows and fear. But the light met it head-on, an explosion of brilliance that swallowed the darkness whole, shattering the remnants of its being into nothingness. In that moment, time stood still. She felt the power of their bond coursing through her, filling her with an overwhelming sense of hope. The shadows dissolved around them, the echoes of the creature's cries fading into the ether, leaving behind a profound silence that wrapped around them like a warm embrace. "Lily," Tom breathed, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes wide as he took in the scene around them. They stood in the clearing, untouched by the darkness that had threatened to consume them. The stars above twinkled brightly, and the gentle rustle of leaves filled the air, as if nature itself rejoiced in their victory. But even in this moment of triumph, a shadow of uncertainty lingered in her heart, a whisper of doubt that refused to fade. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice trembling as she looked up at him. "What if it returns?" He stepped closer, his expression earnest, the warmth of his presence a comforting balm against the remnants of fear that clung to her. "We face it together. That's what matters. We're stronger now, and we'll always be ready if it tries to come back." The truth of his words resonated within her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their battle was far from over. The darkness had been formidable, a force that preyed upon the vulnerable. And while they had emerged victorious this time, she couldn't help but wonder what other shadows lay hidden in the depths of the night, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. "Let's not linger here," she said, her voice steadying as she took a step back from the clearing. "We should find our way back to the town." Tom nodded, his hand slipping into hers as they began to walk. The path ahead was bathed in moonlight, the silvery glow illuminating the way forward. But every step felt heavy, laden with the weight of what they had just endured. The memories of the shadows lingered in her mind, flickering like embers in a fading fire. As they moved deeper into the woods, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sensation prickling at the back of her neck. Shadows danced among the trees, flickering in the corners of her vision. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there, just a quiet rustle of leaves, the soft whisper of the wind. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom's grip on her hand tightened. "Yeah, I feel it too. We need to stay alert." The atmosphere shifted, thickening with an unspoken tension as they pressed onward, deeper into the heart of the woods. The path twisted and turned, leading them away from the familiar and into the unknown. The shadows that flanked them seemed to grow denser, swirling around like phantoms, hiding their true nature beneath layers of darkness. "Maybe we should turn back," she suggested, her heart racing as unease settled in her chest. "No," Tom replied firmly, his voice steady. "We can't let fear dictate our path. We have to keep moving." His resolve bolstered her, yet a nagging worry gnawed at her. With each step, the air grew colder, the silence more profound, and the shadows danced ever closer, as if drawn by an invisible thread. And then, the chanting began anew, a haunting melody that echoed through the trees, weaving through the night air like a silken thread. "No, no," she whispered, dread pooling in her stomach. "Not again." The familiar feeling of despair washed over her, a tide of darkness rising to engulf them once more. The shadows swirled around them, coiling like serpents, and she felt Tom's hand squeeze hers tighter, his body tensing beside her. "Stay close," he murmured, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The chanting grew louder, resonating with an otherworldly beauty that both enchanted and terrified her. It wrapped around her like a shroud, blurring the lines of reality and drawing her deeper into the darkness. She fought against it, struggling to focus, but the pull was irresistible, a force that tugged at her very essence. "Lily!" Tom's voice cut through the haze, grounding her as she stumbled back, her heart racing. "Fight it! Remember what we've done!" She nodded, summoning the memories of their triumph, the light they had forged together. But the shadows pressed in, wrapping around her like a vice, and she could feel the cold seep into her bones, chilling her to the core. "Tom, I can't." "Yes, you can," he shouted, stepping closer to her, his voice fierce with determination. "You're not alone. We're in this together." His words pierced through the veil of darkness, reigniting the flame of hope within her. She squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his presence anchor her as the shadows writhed and twisted around them, the chant rising to a fever pitch. The shadows flickered, a myriad of shapes and faces morphing within their depths, memories of the lost and forgotten swirling in the darkness. They were pleading, screaming for release, and she felt the weight of their despair pressing down on her. "Stay focused," Tom urged, his voice a lifeline amidst the chaos. "We can't let them in." She fought to hold on to the light, to remember the bond that had seen them through before. With every breath, she centered herself, envisioning the glow that had burst forth in the chamber, the brilliance that had vanquished the darkness. "Together!" she shouted, the strength of her voice igniting the spark within. "Her, together," Tom echoed, his eyes blazing with determination. They stood firm against the tide of despair, their hearts synchronized in a rhythm of defiance. The light began to swell around them, pulsing in time with their resolve, illuminating the shadows that threatened to consume them. "Let's show them," she cried, raising her free hand, channeling every ounce of strength into the brilliance that radiated from their bond. The shadows surged forward, the darkness surged forward, an onslaught of whispers and shadows that seemed to materialize from every corner of the night. They twisted and writhed, black tendrils seeking to ensnare Lily and Tom, wrapping around them like a serpent, trying to squeeze the very essence from their souls. The air thickened with an overwhelming sense of despair, the oppressive weight of 1,000 fears pressing down upon them. It was a palpable force, a tangible reminder of the darkness they had just fought to escape. And yet here it was again, lurking in the corners of their minds, waiting to reclaim what it had lost. "Stay close," Tom shouted, his voice a beacon against the encroaching shadows. His grip tightened around her hand, anchoring her amidst the chaos. "I can't breathe," she gasped, struggling against the pressure that seemed to close in around her chest. The shadows whispered secrets, words laced with regret and sorrow, echoing memories of the lives they had claimed. Faces flashed before her eyes, lost souls, trapped and tormented, their eyes pleading for release. "Focus on the light, Lily," Tom urged, his voice cutting through the suffocating darkness like a knife. "Remember what we've done together. We're stronger than this." With every ounce of will, she summoned the warmth of their bond, picturing the radiant light that had once banished the darkness. It flickered at the edges of her consciousness, a tiny flame fighting against the tempest. Together, they shouted in unison, their voices melding into a single force that reverberated through the night. The shadows hesitated, momentarily recoiling, as if struck by an unseen force. For a heartbeat they faltered, and in that moment of hesitation, the light surged forth from Lily and Tom, a brilliant explosion that illuminated the night, casting away the shadows that had threatened to consume them. But the darkness was relentless. It roared back, a guttural growl that sent chills racing down her spine, the sound echoing with the weight of despair. It surged forward again, a tidal wave of malevolence, and Lily felt the air shift, charged with a cold energy that seeped into her bones. "Lily, don't look away," Tom shouted, his voice fierce, urging her to keep her focus. She turned to him, feeling the heat of his presence, a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. "I won't let it take us," she promised, feeling the flicker of the light grow stronger as their resolve intertwined. The shadows seemed to pulse in response, coiling around them like smoke, whispering secrets that twisted through the air. Memories of past failures and fears danced within the darkness, taunting her, trying to unravel her focus. "You're not strong enough," they hissed, voices layered with regret and malice. "You'll always be a prisoner of your fears." But with each taunt, she felt the fire within her ignite, fueled by the memories of laughter, joy, and love that had always triumphed over the shadows in her heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of their bond wash over her like a protective shield. "No," she whispered, her voice steady. "We're stronger than you know. We'll fight for each other." The darkness writhed in fury, the tendrils snapping and snapping, but she could feel the light bursting forth, igniting the night like 1,000 stars. With a fierce shout, they pushed back, their hands raised high, summoning the energy that flowed between them. "Feel it, Lily," Tom urged, his voice fierce and unwavering. "Let it break the chains of despair." The shadows recoiled as the light erupted from them, a radiant force that illuminated the night with dazzling brilliance. The shadows twisted and contorted, their cries mingling with the wind as they were pushed back, caught in the maelstrom of light that swirled around Lily and Tom. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the world caught in a delicate balance between light and darkness. And then, with a resounding crash, the darkness shattered, splintering into a million pieces that danced away into the ether, leaving behind a profound silence that wrapped around them like a warm embrace. Lily and Tom stood together in the aftermath, breathing heavily, their hearts racing as they took in the scene around them. The stars shone brightly above, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet sky, and the gentle rustle of leaves filled the air with a soft melody. "We did it," she breathed, disbelief mingling with relief. "We actually did it," Tom nodded, a smile breaking across his face, a radiant light shining in his eyes. "Together," he said, the word a promise, a testament to their bond that had endured the darkest of trials. But even as they celebrated their victory, a nagging worry tugged at her heart, whispering doubts that refused to fade. "What if it comes back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We'll be ready," Tom replied, his tone resolute. "We've faced it once, and we'll face it again. We're stronger now. We can't let fear control us." With those words, they began to walk back through the woods, the path illuminated by the moonlight. But with each step, the shadows lingered, hovering at the edges of her vision, flickering like dying embers. The journey back felt different, the weight of the night pressing down upon them. The air charged with an electric tension that made her skin crawl. The trees seemed to loom taller, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, grasping for something lost in the depths of the night. "I don't like this," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder as the shadows danced just beyond the reach of the light. "Neither do I," Tom admitted, his voice low, tinged with concern. "But we can't let it get to us. We have to keep moving." They pressed onward, hearts pounding in their chests, but every step felt heavy, the oppressive weight of the darkness lingering like a ghost, haunting their every move. Suddenly, the air shifted, a chill running through the clearing as if a specter had passed through, and the whispering shadows seemed to grow louder, swirling around them like a storm. "What's happening?" she gasped, her heart racing as panic clawed at her throat. "Lily, stay close," Tom shouted, his grip tightening around her hand as the shadows thickened, suffocating the light that had once shielded them. The darkness surged forward, a wave of despair that enveloped them, the tendrils reaching out like claws, seeking to reclaim what they had lost. "Fight it," Tom shouted, his voice fierce and unwavering, urging her to hold on. "I can't," she gasped, the shadows closing in around her, the air thick with their weight. "Together," he cried, pulling her closer, their bond igniting a fire within her. "Together," she echoed, summoning every ounce of strength she had left, the flicker of light within her growing brighter, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. The shadows roared in fury, a cacophony of anger and despair that reverberated through the air. They lunged at them, desperate to reclaim their hold, but Lily and Tom stood firm, their hearts synchronized in a rhythm of defiance. "Feel it," Tom urged, his voice steady as they raised their free hands, channeling every ounce of light they could muster. The darkness hesitated, the tendrils recoiling momentarily as the brilliance burst forth from their connection, illuminating the night with a dazzling light that enveloped them like a warm embrace. But the shadows roared back, an unholy scream that echoed through the trees, reverberating with the weight of 1,000 lost souls. The darkness pressed in, its tendrils snapping like angry serpents, and Lily felt the heat of despair clawing at her throat, threatening to choke her. "We can't let it win," Tom shouted, the fire in his voice igniting her resolve. "Fight for each other." With every ounce of strength, she summoned the warmth of their bond, envisioning the radiant light that had once banished the shadows. It pulsed at the edges of her consciousness, a tiny flame fighting against the tempest, but now it flickered with renewed vigor, fueled by the memories of laughter, joy, and love that had always triumphed over the shadows in her heart. "Together," they shouted, their voices harmonizing in a powerful chorus that surged forth like a tidal wave. The darkness recoiled, a myriad of shapes and faces morphing within its depths, memories of the lost and forgotten swirling in the shadows. They were pleading, screaming for release, and she felt the weight of their despair pressing down on her. But with every taunt, she felt the fire within her ignite, fueled by the strength of their bond. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of their connection wash over her like a protective shield. "No," she whispered, her voice steady. "We're stronger than you know. We'll fight for each other." With that, the light surged forward, erupting in a radiant explosion that illuminated the night with a brilliance that banished the shadows. "Feel it," Tom urged, his voice fierce, urging her to embrace the power that flowed between them. The darkness roared back, a guttural growl that sent chills racing down her spine. But she could feel the light bursting forth, their desperate struggle echoing through the night like a symphony of sorrow. The shadows twisted and writhed, their forms shifting like smoke, clawing at the air with phantom fingers that sought to pull them back into the abyss. The night air crackled with energy, a volatile mix of fear and courage that surged through their veins. Lily felt her heart race, each beat echoing like a drum of war as she held onto Tom's hand, their bond a lifeline in the chaos. The warmth of their connection pulsed brightly, pushing back against the encroaching darkness that sought to swallow them whole. She could feel the desperation in the air, the lost souls within the shadows crying out for release, their voices merging into a haunting chorus that reverberated through her very being. "Don't listen to them," Tom shouted, his voice a beacon in the tumult. "They thrive on fear. We can't let them break us." With a fierce determination, Lily shut her eyes, blocking out the swirling shadows, and focused on the warmth that radiated from Tom's grip. It enveloped her like a blanket, a reminder of their shared memories. Laughter under the sun, quiet moments spent dreaming of a brighter future, the countless times they had fought against the odds together. Those memories ignited a fire within her, a blazing inferno that chased away the chill of despair. Together, they cried in unison, their voices cutting through the cacophony of anguish, summoning the strength that had always thrived between them. The light erupted from their joined hands, a brilliant explosion that illuminated the night like a supernova, banishing the shadows that had clawed at their heels. But the darkness was relentless. It screamed in fury, a sound that reverberated through the trees, a raw, guttural growl that filled the air with a sense of dread. The shadows twisted in response, lashing out like furious serpents, desperate to reclaim their hold. "Stay close," Tom urged, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Lily nodded, her heart pounding fiercely, determination burning bright in her chest. She could feel the darkness encroaching, its whispers slipping into her mind, trying to unravel her resolve. "You're nothing but a memory," she whispered, her voice strong despite the fear coiling around her heart. With each breath, she drew strength from Tom, feeling their bond wrap around her like a protective cocoon. "We are not alone," she reminded herself, picturing the countless souls who had fought for their light, who had battled against the dark. The shadows surged forward, a tidal wave of despair crashing against the brilliance of their light, and for a moment, it felt as if the world would shatter under the weight of their struggle. But Lily and Tom stood firm, their hands raised high, channeling the warmth of their shared memories into a blazing force that pushed back against the encroaching darkness. "Feel the light," Tom shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. In that moment of unity, the shadows recoiled, their forms writhing as if struck by an unseen force. The air shimmered with a golden hue, and Lily felt the light surging within her, an unstoppable force fueled by love and resilience. She opened her eyes, determination etched across her face, and gazed into the swirling mass of shadows that roared in defiance. "We will not be consumed," she cried, her voice steady and unwavering, each word laced with the power of their bond. With that declaration, they pushed forward, the light cascading around them like a waterfall, sweeping away the darkness that had threatened to engulf them. The shadows writhed and twisted, their cries echoing through the night, but the light was relentless, illuminating the path ahead and revealing the truth hidden within the depths of despair. But just as victory seemed within reach, the darkness surged once more, a wild and furious entity that lashed out with renewed fury. Lily gasped as a tendril whipped past her, grazing her cheek and sending a chill racing through her body. The shadows lashed out again, wrapping around her ankle, pulling her toward the gaping maw of despair that loomed just beyond their radiant light. "Lily!" Tom shouted, panic flooding his voice as he felt the grip of the darkness tighten around her. "I won't let go," she screamed, her heart racing as she fought against the shadow's grasp. The darkness hissed, a cacophony of rage that filled the air, echoing with the weight of 1,000 souls lost to despair. "Fight it, Lily. Fight for us," Tom urged, desperation coloring his voice as he reached for her, his own hand stretching toward her, willing their connection to break through the suffocating grip of the shadows. "I can't," she gasped, feeling the chill seep deeper into her bones, but she forced herself to focus on the light, on the warmth that had always surrounded them. "Together," they shouted, their voices intertwining, merging into a single force that surged through the darkness. With each pulse of their bond, the light grew brighter, illuminating the night like a beacon of hope amidst the encroaching shadows. The tendrils of darkness hesitated, their furious lashings slowing as they recoiled from the radiance. "Feel it, Lily. We're stronger together." Tom's voice was fierce, a lifeline in the tempest that threatened to consume her. With every ounce of will, she focused on the warmth of their connection, envisioning the light that had once banished the shadows. It flickered at the edges of her consciousness, a tiny flame fighting against the tempest. The shadows roared in fury, a sound that rattled the trees, and with every breath, she summoned the strength within, channeling the memories of their shared laughter and dreams. "We're stronger than this," she shouted, feeling the fire ignite within her once more. "Together," they echoed, their voices harmonizing in a symphony of defiance that surged forth like a tidal wave. The darkness recoiled, the tendrils snapping and hissing in response. But Lily felt the warmth growing, a radiant force that illuminated the night with a brilliance that cast away the shadows. The darkness roared back, an unholy scream that echoed through the trees, reverberating with the weight of despair. Lily felt the chill wrap around her, a palpable fear clawing at her throat. But with each heartbeat, she focused on the light, on the love that had driven them to this moment. "Lily, we can do this," Tom urged, his voice steady and fierce, pushing her forward. She nodded, their hands intertwined, and with a surge of courage, they raised their hands high, summoning the energy that flowed between them. The shadows shrieked, their cries of anger mingling with despair, but the light blazed brighter, illuminating the path ahead, revealing the truth hidden within the depths of their struggle. "Feel the warmth, Lily. Feel the power of our bond," Tom shouted, his voice breaking through the darkness. The shadows hesitated, momentarily recoiling, and in that fleeting moment, Lily and Tom pressed forward, the light erupting from them in a radiant explosion that illuminated the night with dazzling brilliance. But just as victory seemed to grasp at their fingertips, the shadows lunged forward, a swirling mass of fury and despair that engulfed them once more. The darkness pressed in around them, its tendrils reaching out like claws, seeking to reclaim what they had fought so hard to protect. "Fight it," Tom shouted, his voice fierce, and Lily felt the warmth of their connection igniting once more, a fire that surged through her veins. With every ounce of strength, she pushed back against the darkness, her heart racing, and in that moment, the light burst forth from within, an unstoppable force that surged through the shadows. The darkness screamed in rage, the sound echoing through the night, but Lily and Tom stood firm, their hearts synchronized in a rhythm of defiance. "Together," they cried, their voices rising above the chaos, and with that declaration, the light exploded from their hands, a brilliant force that pushed back against the encroaching shadows. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze, the world caught in a delicate balance between light and darkness. And then, with a resounding crash, the darkness shattered, splintering into a million pieces that danced away into the ether, leaving behind a profound silence that wrapped around them like a warm embrace. Lily and Tom stood together in the aftermath, breathing heavily, their hearts racing as they took in the scene around them. The stars shone brightly above, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet sky, and the gentle rustle of leaves filled the air with a soft melody. "We did it," she breathed, disbelief mingling with relief. "We actually did it," Tom nodded, a smile breaking across his face, a radiant light shining in his eyes. "Together," he said, the word of promise, a testament to their bond that had endured the darkest of trials. But even as they celebrated their victory, a nagging worry tugged at her heart, whispering doubts that refused to fade. "What if it comes back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We'll be ready," Tom replied, his tone resolute. "We've faced it once, and we'll face it again. We're stronger now. We can't let fear control us." With those words, they began to walk back through the woods, the path illuminated by the moonlight. But with each step, the shadows lingered, hovering at the edges of her,